All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to uncover the staggering scale and, honestly, the pretty surprising economics behind the food sitting on your plate. We're looking at the totally fascinating contrast between how different regions of the United States approach the absolutely monumental task of feeding the nation and, frankly, the entire world. It's a story of sprawling lands, incredible human effort, and a massive paradox that might just completely change the way you look at your next trip to the grocery store. Now, before we really get into the numbers, you might naturally assume the state with the most land and the most farms wears the crown. I mean, it makes logical sense, right? More land equals more crops, which should equal more money. But as we dig into the data today, we're going to find out that the crown for American farming is actually split. And who wears it depends entirely on whether you value sheer physical size or cold, hard cash. So here is our central mystery. How exactly does Texas have nearly 4 times as many farms as California, yet make less than half the revenue? The contrast is honestly staggering. Texas dedicates an astounding 77% of its entire land area to agriculture. We're talking 248,000 farms that pull in about $22.1 billion. Meanwhile, California operates with a tiny fraction of that footprint, just 69,000 active farms. But it absolutely shatters the revenue scale, bringing in over $49 billion. Section 1. Texas, Scale, and Sprawl. To solve this farming paradox, we first need to understand the Texas business model, which is all about vast, land-intensive agriculture. So, looking at Texas, livestock is absolutely the undisputed heavyweight here. It pulls in $12.3 billion and devours roughly half of the state's entire agricultural revenue pie. While Texas does grow significant amounts of corn and produces a lot of milk and broilers, the wide open spaces of the state are just perfectly suited for raising animals. But they aren't just raising animals. They're also farming one of the absolute most space-demanding crops on Earth. To put that massive scale into perspective, Texas dedicates 5.3 million acres just to cotton. Those 7.7 million bales put the United States right up there on the global stage. Texas accounts for 43% of all the cotton area in the entire country, generating about $1.7 billion annually from this one crop alone. When you compare it globally, the U.S. sits solidly in third place, right behind China and India. And honestly, that is almost entirely thanks to those massive, sprawling Texas cotton fields that are harvested by heavy machinery every year from mid-October to December. Moving on to Section 2, the reality of modern ranching. Let's switch gears to the animal side of Texas farming, because when you aren't planting cotton down there, you are managing herds, and the logistics of that are literally mind-boggling. Now, here's a wild contrast right within the exact same state. While Texas cattle casually roam up to 15 miles a day across vast open spaces, the state's 943,000 goats are kept on a very, very tight leash. Cattle will completely utilize those expansive ranges for grazing. Goats, on the other hand, they are highly vulnerable. Because of predators like coyotes and wildcats, farmers have to restrict these goats to a tiny 1.2-mile radius, herding them into protective stables every single afternoon without fail. And managing all those herds across a staggering 97 million acres of grazing land, well, it takes a massive human toll. $33,000. That is the average annual salary of a hardworking Texas cowboy today. It really highlights the sheer human effort required to maintain this giant system. Cowboys, often relying on cattle dogs, spend their days moving these massive herds across the allowed grazing ranges just to make sure they're fed. It's an incredibly intense, gritty lifestyle driven by pure physical scale, not by high profit margins per acre. When you're managing 13% of all the cattle in the United States, it literally requires an immense amount of space and human effort. Again, prioritizing physical scale over high profit margins. With 174,000 ranchers overseeing nearly 11 million cattle, you really start to see why Texas has to dedicate 77% of its land to farming. The entire model is built on volume and wide open spaces. But, as we know from our initial paradox, having a massive volume of land doesn't always equal the highest revenue. Section 3, high-value, hand-picked harvests. All right, let's pivot westward to crack the second half of our paradox and see exactly how California extracts massive revenue from a much, much smaller footprint. Think about your own diet for a second. Honestly, how often do you use lettuce in your meals? Supplying that huge national demand requires a highly specialized approach to land. If every single person in the country is eating nearly 13 pounds of just this one leafy green every year, someone has to grow it at a massive, rapid scale. And it turns out one state has essentially cornered the market on these specialty crops. Well, California absolutely dominates specialty crops like lettuce. They dedicate highly optimized land to crops that yield way more dollars per acre than those sprawling cattle ranches we just talked about. While Texas uses about 3,700 acres for lettuce, California utilizes 71% of the entire country's lettuce growing area. And this right here is the secret to their massive $49 billion revenue. They focus intensely on high-value, fast-moving specialty produce rather than crops that require millions of acres to actually turn a profit.
But, and this is a huge but, there is an intense piece rate manual labor cost required to harvest these delicate, high-value items that machines simply cannot pick. Unlike the giant mechanical harvesters rolling through Texas cotton fields, California's wealth relies heavily on migrant workers picking crops totally by hand. Take the state's 682 olive farms, for example. Workers handpick billions of olives, finishing maybe 2 whole trees a day for about $95. Or consider the 150 workers earning $9 an hour carefully selecting grape leaves for high-end restaurants. It is incredibly meticulous, painstaking work.
And you know, this perfectly captures the California advantage, turning totally unexpected, niche crops into highly profitable commodities. We normally think of cherry blossoms just for sightseeing, right? But workers are out there being paid $80 to $100 a day to hand harvest these fragile flowers, so they can be used in teas, cocktails, and even as vegetables in California restaurants. It's just a flawless example of extracting maximum monetary value from a very specialized small-scale crop. Let's look at the meticulous 3-step process behind California raisins. Derived from 147,000 acres of seedless grapes, this is a prime example of labor-intensive value creation. Over 9,000 workers flock to these vineyards, working in the hot, dusty air just to pick billions of grapes. And they don't just ship them off right away. No, they leave them right there on the farm to dry in the punishing sun for 3 full weeks before finally sending them to the factory. It's a really slow, labor-heavy process, but that end product is phenomenally dense in value. Which brings us to Section 4, the billion-pound berry belt. Finally, let's explore one of the absolute most lucrative and labor-demanding sectors of West Coast agriculture. The numbers here are literally staggering. Just 35,000 acres in California generate a mind-boggling 1.1 billion pounds of strawberries. This proves once and for all that incredible yields absolutely don't always require Texas-sized acreage. To put that into perspective, that single, relatively small footprint accounts for 83% of the entire nation's strawberry production. They're achieving massive output and massive revenue by packing an incredible amount of agricultural value into every single square foot of soil. And this high-revenue model stretches right across the West Coast, completely relying on thousands of migrant workers who are paid by the bucket and the box. When July rolls around, thousands of workers tie small buckets to their waists, earning $7 for every bucket of fragile raspberries they carefully detach from the vine down in California. Up in Washington, 7,000 workers do the same exact thing for 17,000 acres of blueberries, pulling in $9 for every box they fill. Without this vast, dedicated workforce performing back-breaking manual labor, literally bucket by bucket, box by box, this entire high-value agricultural model would completely collapse. So what does this all mean? Well, I really hope this explainer has changed how you view the incredible economics behind your next meal and leaves you wondering about the true hidden costs of the harvest. We've seen the paradox solved, haven't we? Texas uses immense space and heavy machinery to completely dominate livestock and cotton. Meanwhile, California uses dense, high-value specialty crops and thousands of human hands to generate double the revenue on a fraction of the land. So the very next time you grab a handful of raisins, a fresh strawberry, or a slice of brisket, you're going to know exactly the scale of land and the incredible scale of human effort it took to get it there. Thanks for learning with me today. I'll catch you next time.